Raja had class and a clientele who, 19, Pearl Dedge, recognized and appreciated it, from the carefully made up doctors' wives who no longer had to do their own manicures, to the misplaced romantics who spent all their time and hard-earned vacation money trying to impress the unimpressible showgirls. The Raja's place was the place to see and be seen. Now, the white woman was pretty much out of sight during this time, so everybody just assumed she was the cook because somebody was back there cooking up a storm and it wasn't the Raja, who was forever out front being smooth. But nobody can say for sure whether that had anything to do with what happened. Everybody said it was a shame too, because the place was doing so well. The story is that one night, long after closing time and cleanup, a big party of folks came strolling over, drunk and happy and wanting something good to eat. Although he was locking up for the night and the white woman was already standing at the foot of the porch steps, he couldn't say no. He graciously unlocked the door, turned on the lights, and ushered them inside to a table. The woman didn't move. The Raja went to the door and spoke to her firmly. The woman still didn't move. The Raja spoke to her again, more sharply this time. And it is at this point that the two versions of the story diverge. In one version, she hisses nigger at him from outside so loudly that the patrons can hear the insult from where they sit. In another version, she comes back in and shouts it at him from across the room. In any case, wherever she was when she said it, and the Raja narrowed his eyes and turned away from the chair he was holding for a bronzed beauty in a calico sundress and leaped at the white woman like a real Bombay tiger. They fought all the way out the door and down the steps and disappeared into the great north woods with her hollering and him hollering, and that turban and that accent and that 2020, what looks like crazy on an ordinary day, shouted charge of secret negritude flying every which way, and nobody ever saw either one of them again, which just goes to show you, the oldsters would say, leaving you alone to consider all this while they eased off to pour themselves another drink. Wherever you go, there you are. 500. If I hadn't asked Eddie to stop at the liquor store, none of this shit would have happened. Well, it might have happened, but it would be somebody else's problem, which would have been fine with me. I got enough problems of my own. It's a good thing Eddie remembered to go back for the vodka after. The confusion died down because I damn sure needed a drink. When we first pulled into the parking lot, there wasn't another soul around. Eddie went in and I'm just sitting there, being glad he offered so I wouldn't have to jump my tired ass out of this truck again before we got to Joyce's. All of a sudden, a big old brown and white Cadillac screeches into the lot and brakes so hard it skids 3 feet before it rocks to a stop. The passenger door opens up fast and a woman jumps out and drags a little boy out right behind her. He's about 1.5 years old maybe and has on a sagging diaper and a filthy t-shirt. His mama, I guess she was his mama, but she could have been his sister, is cussing up a storm at whoever is still in the car, and she sort of tosses the baby off to one side over in the direction of the payphone to keep him out of harm's way. Then she turns toward the man who was sliding out from behind the wheel, headed in her direction. She was little, plus she didn't have any shoes on, so he might have looked bigger than he really was. Either way, he was big enough and he was mad. He got around the car so quickly she didn't have a chance to run. He grabbed her arm and shook her so hard her earrings flew off and her tiny little 21 Pearl Dedge black skirt rode up over her behind and gathered around her waist like a wide belt. Her panties had a heart over the crotch and the lace was gone around one leg. Then he slapped her hard, and when her head jerked over to the side, he backhanded her the other way and slapped her again. He was screaming that he was going to kill her, and she was screaming, "Stop, stop, stop," and the baby had fallen down, and he was screaming too. Eddie must have heard all the commotion. Everybody for a mile could hear it, but I didn't see him come out. All of a sudden, he was just there. He pulled the man away from the woman and flung him back so hard the guy staggered and almost fell. The woman was scrambling around in the car looking for her shoes and her purse. The man was much younger than I'd thought. So was the girl. They looked like high school kids. I hope that wasn't their baby, but I knew it probably was. The guy got up and ran at Eddie like he was going to knock him out of the way to get at the girl again. Eddie, crouched down a little bit until the guy was almost up on him. Then he sort of lunged forward, his arm shot out, and he hit the guy square in the Adam's apple. The guy went down like he'd been shot, gasping and gagging and trying to catch his breath. I sat there with my mouth open. I had come all the way to Idlewild and landed in the middle of a damn kung fu movie. The girl had her shoes in her hand now. The baby had crawled over and was holding onto her leg. They were both quiet, watching Eddie. He asked her if she was okay, and she nodded. So he picked up the keys where them and handed them to her. She asked if the boy was going, had dropped to die. And when Eddie said no, she said she didn't want to take the car then, since she figured he would really kill her if he got himself together. And she had nodded like that, made any kind of 22 guy, him stranded Eddie one have hose, what looks like crazy on an ordinary day. Keys and rolled that big old piece of car back and forth across that Negro until I got tired, but that's just me. Next thing I know, Eddie's opening the door and she's squeezing in next to me so we can drop her off at home. Her face is pretty swollen and she's so out of it, her skirt is still bunched up around her waist. Eddie hands her the baby, who definitely needs a diaper change and who takes one look at me and starts crying again. His mother doesn't seem to hear it for the first mile or so, but it must have had a cumulative effect on her nerves, because when we were almost there, she reached down and pinched his leg so hard that he gasped and tried to holler, but he couldn't make another sound and didn't for the rest of the trip. Once he shut up, the girl started muttering to herself like we weren't even there. Motherfucker just lying. He know he my baby daddy. Look at his damn face. Look just like him. Nigga, no, I ain't been fucking nobody but him since his ass got here and he can't give me $5 a week. What the fuck I'm supposed to do for money? What the fuck I'm supposed to do? We took her to a tiny cinder block house at the bottom of an overgrown, unpaved road with no lake at the end to redeem it. The yard was full of trash and broken toys and an ancient Ford Mustang on its own set of cinder blocks. She mumbled a quick thanks and jumped out as soon as Eddie stopped the truck, dragging the baby out behind her and finally pulling her skirt down over her little narrow behind, which she had the nerve to be switching as she went on up. The walk to the house. Sorry about that, Eddie said, turning the truck around and heading back toward Joyce's. I said, I wasn't expecting to see anything like that up here. He looked at me and smiled. Welcome home. I remembered how fast he had moved back there. The kid never saw it coming. Where'd you learn to do that? Army, he said. He'll be all right as soon as he, 23, Pearl Dedge, catches his breath. That was a move the MPs used to us, so it's just to slow you down, not kill you. An important distinction, I said, realizing my hair were shaking. I kept seeing that girl's head flopping AR when the guy was slapping her. I know that kid, Eddie said. I was surprised. You do? He nodded. He's trouble. Seems the kid came up from Detroit a couple of years ago to stay with his sister, who, coincidentally, is the words Joyce took to the hospital. Our small world. There's another sister, too. Maddie, Eddie saw. They're supposed to be providing a more stable environment for the young brother, but whoever sent him didn't bother to check out the house. Bad? Crack. I couldn't believe it. Where do they get crack waj up here? From the city, he said. All these little towns are virgin markets for these young wannabe gangsters. People sitting around here with nothing to do and a police force with 2 cops who share one squad car. They probably don't ever know what crack looks like. It's easy money. I shouldn't have been surprised. Crack is an epidemic with a life all its own, just like AIDS. Small town living doesn't save you anymore. I didn't scare you, did I? He turned sideways to peer over at me since it was almost dark now. I shook my head. No, he wanted to hurt that girl. I'm glad you knew how to handle it. The Army teaches you a lot of stuff like that, he said, turning down the road to Joyce's house. The problem is, most of it is stuff you wish you didn't need to know. 24-0. Joyce's house, the house I grew up in, sits at the end of an oiled but unpaved road that opens out into Idlewild Lake. There are other houses scattered around the edges of the lake, but they're spaced wide enough so that you don't have to worry about people being all up in your business. A lot of the houses are empty now anyway. Once the white resort started accepting Negroes, people stopped coming to Idlewild. The oldsters who put such stock in their summer cottages when this was a big shot resort haven't been able to interest their children and grandchildren in a place they had never seen on a travel brochure and whose name nobody had ever heard outside Detroit and Chicago. Our parents moved here at the very end of the place's heyday. I was 5 and Joyce was ready to start high school. Anybody with any practical sense could see the handwriting on the wall, but my father had a big dream about opening a new nightclub that would single-handedly bring back the glory days. My mother, as usual, never questioned a word he said, even though they lost all their savings when the place went belly up in one short season. My father died in his sleep, drunk and disappointed, the winter right after, and my mother never got over it. It wasn't a bad place to be a kid, having a lake at the edge of the front yard, beat walking across a freeway bridge to get to kindergarten. Joyce and Mitch hooked up as soon as he saw her sitting 2 rows in front of him in geometry class, and once they got married and Mom made me an official orphan, it was like having real young, real hip parents. I could see the darkness of the lake just a few hundred yards from where Eddie pulled the truck into the yard. I heard the whispering of the pine trees that surrounded the house. 25, 25, Pearl Dedge. And I realized I was truly glad to be home, even if the meant was only temporary. Arrar. Joyce wasn't there yet, but I probably wouldn't gone to Eddie's for dinner if she hadn't redecorated my room. Eddie carried my suitcases down the hall for me, and when I went ahead of him and turned on the light, I thought I'd walked into the wrong house. Joyce sent me a Magaz article a couple of months ago that said blue is a healing call, and I guess it made a big impression on her because everything in here is now seriously blue. Dark blue, light blue, turquoise, midnight, robin's egg, blue plaid, blue prince, sky BL, and navy. It would be funny, except it means she's still trying to fix it. Like if blue was the cure, I wouldn't be wearing BLA panties, blue bra, blue blouse, blue jeans, blue socks, BLA shoes, and blue contacts right now. Any different? I knew part of the reason Joyce was glad I was coming for this visit was so she could see if I still looked okay, which is the really fucked up part of all this. I don't feel any different, but everything is different, every single thing, and all the blue curtains in the world can't change that. Suddenly, the idea of sitting in that blue room all by myself, drinking too much vodka, and waiting for Joyce to come home seemed like the worst possible way to spend my first night back. Besides, I was hungry, and Eddie assured me he was a good, fast cook who could feed me and have me back home in under an hour and a half. I left a note for Joyce and stuck the vodka in my purse on my way out the door. I still wanted a drink, and at this point, I felt like I had earned it. 26, 25, 7. In Eddie's whole house, there was not a scrap of anything blue, except some photographs of the lake where the water and the sky came together, but that doesn't really count. That's real blue. Everything was sort of a soothing wheat color, except for a pile of bright red pillows stacked on the floor. There were bamboo mats, a futon couch, and a small table with 2 chairs. He had a couple of bookcases full of record albums. An elaborate, old-fashioned stereo system sat in the corner looking well-used and well-kept. The kitchen belonged in a small restaurant. Hanging pots, stacked steamers, juicers, blenders, knives, woks, and 3 well-stocked spice racks. After I fixed myself a drink, he told me dinner would be ready in 20 minutes and I could put on anything I wanted to hear. I always like to look at people's music. It can alert you to the presence of things that you might not find out otherwise until much later. I remember going to a guy's apartment in Atlanta for the first time and discovering that he had a huge collection of heavy metal. The bad white boys. The ones who have to go to court all the time to prove their evil lyrics and demonic chord progressions didn't make somebody's child shoot himself in the head. He had the good sense to be a little embarrassed about it, but I never felt the same about him after that. Eddie looked like a jazz fan, and those dreads definitely indicated reggae. He had hundreds of records neatly filed in alphabetical order. The first one was one of my favorites, King Sunny Ade, Juju Music. I pulled it out of the cover and held the edges, checking for cracks. Are people who have grown up on. Don't understand the sensual appeal of a well-loved Piece 71. Joyce and Mitch loved their albums, even the ones, 27, Pearl Drage, that were so scratched up you could barely make out the vocals. Every scratch meant something. Every nick recalled a perfect party, every smudge a teenage heartache. From the condition of the cover, Juju music was well used, but inside it was perfect. I placed it carefully on the turntable and lowered the dust cover. This was somebody who took his records seriously. I had been wrong about the jazz, except for 2 John Coltrane's and a Miles Davis or 2, but right on the reggae. Old school, he seemed to have every album Bob Marley and Gregory Isaacs ever recorded, but he also had a serious Motown library, heavy on the Temptations and Marvin Gaye, a fair number of funk classics by George Clinton, James Brown and the Ohio Players, and the Essential Sly and the Family Stone. There was also a lot of international stuff that I was curious about, but I was too exhausted to look any further. When I complimented him on having his music so well organized, he looked embarrassed. Shows I've got too much time on my hands. Idlewild still the fun capital of the Great North Woods? I said, wondering again why he was living here. Absolutely, he said. That's half the reason these young people are acting such a big fool. Nothing else to do. He was chopping vegetables rhythmically, and I liked the kitcheny sound of the knife hitting the gleaming piece of butcher block. I took my drink back over to the counter. He checked the oil in a large wok he'd put on the stove. He said, "You know the thing I always remember about you? I was surprised he remembered anything about me. Last time I saw him, I was 8 years old, and my sister was hoping he would get there in time to stand up with Mitch at their wedding. He did, even though his uniform looked like he'd slept in it twice. I have no idea," I said, dropping another ice cube into my already watery drink. I'm 28, 25, what looks like crazy on an ordinary day. "You told me not to go to Nam." "I did." "Yes, you did," he said, dumping the vegetables into the wok and tossing them in the air with a slotted bamboo paddle. He made it look easy, but I know if I had tried it, we'd be eating dinner off the kitchen floor. You waited until my date went to the bathroom. I loved what she had on. That was the first strapless dress I'd ever seen up close. "Me too," he said, spooning the vegetables onto 2 plates of steaming noodles. It looked and smelled wonderful, and I realized I was starving. I'd been drinking all day, but I couldn't remember when I had eaten anything. "When you saw me standing by myself, you came over and asked me if I was really going to go to Vietnam. When I said yes, you told me it was a terrible war and that it would be wrong and dangerous for me to fight in it. I liked the way you said that. Wrong and dangerous." The conversation was beginning to come back to me. Joyce and Mitch were both involved in anti-war activities, although there was never much of a peace movement in Idlewild. When people got drafted, they had a party, got drunk, tried to talk their girlfriend of the moment into having sex, and reported for duty. Most of the local protesting consisted of sending Indig, Nat letters to Congress and driving to bigger cities to march or demonstrate or demand something from whoever was in charge at the moment. They used to take me with them whenever I wanted to go, and I was caught up in the righteous passion of the demonstrators and their cause. When Mitch first found out Eddie had been drafted, he tried to talk him out of going and even offered to drive him over into Canada to a community of Black draft resistors holed up in Windsor. But Eddie just laughed and said somebody had to protect the women and children since all the wimps were getting married and couldn't be bothered to go. "Did I offer to smuggle you into Canada?" He laughed. "That's exactly what you did. You told me Mitch probably couldn't go right then since he had just gotten married, but you were sure he'd take me first thing in the morning." I could hear myself saying it too, like it was the only reasonable way to deal with the situation. So, of course, he was going to do it. I was always sure about things in those days. It wasn't until recently that I started second guessing myself. "You obviously didn't take my advice," I said. "But I should have." He said, "You were right. Worst move I ever made." "Well, at least you got it out of the way when you were young," I said. "I saved my worst moves until much later." "I'll bet you wouldn't know a bad move if you saw one," he said. "You'd be surprised. Maybe we can compare notes one day." He picked up both plates and headed for the kitchen. "It's a deal," I said, feeling the weight of the day settling around my shoulders. It was time for me to crash, but I was going to help with the dishes first. I wanted to be sure he washed all the things I'd used in good hot soapy water. I know that's not the way you get it, but this was no time to be careless. 8. When we pulled up into the yard, Joyce was standing at the door reading my note. She turned and ran down the back steps and grabbed me in a big hug. Joyce gained a lot of weight when Mitch died, and even though it's been 2 years, she's still carrying it. Worrying about me probably hasn't helped her what looks like crazy on an ordinary day. Diet much either. Her cheeks were so chubby that when she smiled, her eyes almost disappeared. She reported that Eartha had a baby girl and thanked Eddie for picking me up. I thanked him for dinner, and he asked Joyce if her car was still acting funny. And when she said it was, he said he'd come by tomorrow and look under the hood before she went back to the hospital. I wondered suddenly if they were lovers, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like friends. As soon as Eddie left and we got inside, Joyce threw her arms around me and started apologizing for being late and asking me if I'd eaten enough, and apologizing some more until finally I said, "Hold it. This is the part where you get to ask me how I'm feeling, and I get to say I'm feeling fine, and you get to look at me hard to see if I'm lying, and if I'm not, you get to hug me again and say, 'Welcome home, little sister. You look great.'" She teared up when I said that, and her body felt soft and plump when she hugged me. I've had clients whose husbands died and they blew up like balloons in no time. It's a lot harder to take care of your body when nobody's going to see you naked. Great. "Welcome home, little sister," she said. "You look." "Thank you," I said. "Now tell me everything." Turned out the 17-year-old new mother had been lying about keeping up with her appointments for prenatal care and hadn't seen the doctor since her second visit. The doctor said they had tried to contact her, but all the information she'd given them was bogus, which was really unfortunate since he had some bad news. Before she had stopped coming, she had tested positive for HIV when the doctor told her after the delivery. But she freaked out and started screaming that they were lying, and she didn't have to stay and hear no more shit from them about what she had or didn't have, and to just hand her back what she came with and she'd get the hell out of there. 31, Pearl Dedge. The doctor finally gave her a sedative, and Joyce sat with her until she calmed down and went to sleep. The baby's tests wouldn't be back until morning. Or what did he think her reaction would be? Joyce said. He just told her outright, no preparation or anything. She's lying there with a brand new baby and he just tells her like that. He didn't even give a damn. He might as well have been talking to a chimpanzee. Joyce looked like hell. Her hair needed rebraiding. Her sweats were working overtime to accommodate her new hips and thighs, and her sandals were tired Woodstock one at best. "How's your diet coming?" I said. She tried to get her feelings hurt, but I wasn't going for it. "I'm working on it," she said. I just looked at her. "I've lost 15 pounds, she said. I raised my eyebrows. "Okay, 10. I knew the best she could claim was holding steady, and she knew it too. "So, sue me," she said. I had a couple of months when all that stood between me and taking a tumble was a bowl of Jamocha almond fudge and some homemade Toll House cookies. I should have known. The dread tumble. When my mother committed suicide, some religious group sent us a bunch of pamphlets they had put together for the bereaved loved ones struggling to understand. We were pretty desperate for some kind of straightforward way to talk about what had happened, but when we read these little booklets, they were mostly full of ways not to talk about it, or if you did, to be sure you put the weight on the dearly departed and not on yourself. Coping with guilt seemed to be a major deal for these particular pamphleteers, and one of them suggested that even using the word suicide gave it too much guilt-producing power. The left behind loved ones were encouraged to try out new. 32, what looks like crazy on an ordinary day, or words or phrases to describe the indescribable. The author offered several suggestions, including the fairly generic slipped away, the slightly more judgmental took a wrong turn. And our all-time favorite tumbled into the abyss. After that, whenever we talked about suicide, we talked about taking a tumble. I just couldn't believe he wasn't coming back, Joyce said. At first, I kept thinking if I could make it through that first year, I'd be okay. But I wasn't okay. "It takes time," I said. "I know," she took my hand. "This is terrible, but sometimes I used to sit here and make lists in my head of all the people who deserved to die more than Mitch. I know that game. Not one of my favorites." She shook her head as if to make sure there was no part of her brain still secretly taking names. "Better now?" I said, remembering one night after the funeral when I got up and found Joyce sitting in the dark by herself, holding Mitch's glasses and crying. Much better, she said. Once I stopped feeling guilty about living off the life insurance money and quit working for the state, I got so busy with the sewing circus, I didn't have time to be sitting around here driving myself crazy. Guilty, I said. Why? When the check first came, it felt like blood money to me. How much could they pay me to make up for Mitch? Ain't that much money in the world, I said, and I meant it. Mitch was one of a kind. You got that right. So I put it away and didn't touch any of it for a long time. Then I realized how much I really wanted to find a way to fix the things we'd been busy half repairing with all the tired programs that don't work and the exhausted people who don't care. Mitch's insurance let me buy myself enough time to try. It was almost funny. In the middle of all the bad things, 33, Pearl Dedge, that have come our way, we both emerged as sisters of independent means. Joyce frowned and shook her head. That's why this stuff with Eartha really makes me mad. She's been coming every week for the last 4 months, lying the whole time. And for what? Because she'd rather smoke crack than have a healthy baby. What the hell is the sewing circus? I said, but Joyce just yawned, which made me yawn too. We were both pretty exhausted. That's too long a story to start on this late at night, she said, but I'll tell you everything tomorrow. I promise. Joyce's room was quiet, and I had settled into my blue heaven before realizing I hadn't told her about Eddie punching out the guy in the parking lot. We both had some stories to tell in the morning. 9. The hospital called to say the baby tested negative for HIV, positive for cocaine, and that they were going to do some more tests. So Joyce couldn't see the baby until tomorrow. The other big news was that the mother had disappeared. Not disappeared as in, now you see her, now you don't. Disappeared as in, got up, got dressed, put on her shoes, picked up her purse, and walked out. Joyce can't understand it, but I can. Homegirl's trying to walk away from that HIV. She's trying to decide if she's going to tell anybody or just keep living her life and see what happens. I used to wish I hadn't taken the test so I still wouldn't know. Before I tested, I had been celibate for almost a year. I'd had enough of those Atlanta Negroes for a while. They talk so much shit when they're looking for some sweetness. 34, what looks like crazy on an ordinary day, but they got no heart for the long haul. I figured 10 years of rolling around with them was plenty. Besides, in spite of what people will try to tell you, Atlanta is still a very small town. And the way I'd been living, it was getting downright ridiculous. I'd walk into a reception and there'd be a room full of brothers, power brokering their asses off, and I'd realize I'd seen them all naked. I'd watch them striding around, talking to each other in those phony-ass voices men use when they want to make it clear they got juice. And it was so depressing. All I'd want to do was go home and get drunk. Then I started keeping company with a bearded saxophone player who wore 2 gold hoops in each ear and played regularly at a club downtown. We hadn't formalized anything yet, but we'd been hanging pretty tough for about 3 months, and he was making me rethink this whole celibacy thing in a serious way. He wasn't much taller than me and built kind of round, but he had a lot of style, and he could make a sax sound so sweet you couldn't decide if you wanted to take him or the horn home to bed with you. He'd already been tested, so it was on me. When I got the results and told him, he sat there and listened to me tell it all, and then he picked up his coat and his horn case and walked out the door. No good, bye. No damn, baby, what we gonna do? Nothing. 1 minute he was there, then he was gone. That was it. I went with Joyce to see Eartha's sister. I had told her about what happened at the liquor store yesterday, and I figured, why not meet the rest of what seemed to be a supremely fucked up family? The woman who came to the door let out a blast of that peppermint-smelling vapor that means crack smoked here, but Joyce didn't blink. Joyce was a state caseworker for 15 years, and she'd been in most of the houses around here investigating for or against more benefits, custody rights, food stamp eligibility, all the questions that drive poor 35, 55, Pearl Dedge, people crazy. By this time, she was kind of like the telephone man or the cable guy. Nothing shocked her. Hey, Maddie, is Eartha around? Maddie, who looked to be about 40 but was probably much younger, frowned at Joyce, confused. You the one took her to the emergency room, right? Joyce said yes, but the hospital had just called to notify her that Eartha had walked out and taken all her things with her except the baby. This did not sit well with Maddie, who thought we were going to tell her she had to take the kid. Oh no, she said. Fuck that. I ain't raising no more kids, especially no screaming crack baby. Joyce tried to tell Maddie that's not what we came for, but the woman was having none of it. Call the daddy if somebody got to take the little motherfucker, she said. Who is the father? Joyce had her social worker voice on. How the hell do I know? Maddie said, one of them crackhead niggas she been fucking for some rock. Shut the damn door, somebody yelled from the other room. You letting all the damn smoke out, fool. Fuck you. The woman laughed with a cackle that ended in a huge explosion of coughing and then another evil look in our direction. Joyce took a deep breath. She was trying to be cool. The hospital said the baby can come home on Friday. Maddie interrupted her. And if she don't come home, they ain't going to do nothing but send her to foster care just like they do all the other crackhead babies. So what difference it make? She's your niece, Joyce said, and I could hear her getting mad. Don't you think Eartha would want you to keep the baby until she gets back? This really struck Maddie as funny. Gets back? Eartha Lee ain't coming back here till she runs out of other places to go, and that baby be long gone by then. That girl ain't cut out to be 36, what looks like crazy on an ordinary day. Nobody mama, so just call them nice white folks at the hospital and tell them don't nobody over here want her. So they may as well bundle her little ass up and send her to somebody who do. The kid Eddie punched out in the parking lot came and stood behind Maddie in the doorway. He was tall enough to look over the top of her head without straining. The brother of the house. Joyce looked at him. Hello, Frank. What the fuck our dumbass sister done now? He said. She had that baby, Maddie said. No shit, he said, narrowing his eyes at me like I suddenly looked familiar. Well, you see one crack baby, you seen 'em all? He laughed, pushed Maddie back inside, and then turned and pointed at me. And you do me a favor, all right? You tell Kung Fu I said to stay black, okay? 10. Tell me about the sewing circus. I asked Joyce as we sat on the back porch drinking apple cinnamon tea and trying to get the crack smell out of our nostrils. Joyce grinned at me. TSC is you and me, she said. It's the wave of the future and they don't even know it. Most of the people up here think it's still 1958 and we're dealing with some high-spirited youngsters who are just sowing their wild oats. They can't see that this is something new. This isn't a phase they're going through. This is how they are. They don't know anything. They don't care about anything. They're selfish and mean and mad all the time. Who do you think is breaking into these old people's houses? Or what old people's houses? I said. Joyce was getting excited, and when she gets excited, she talks fast. 37, Pearl Dedge. It's practically an epidemic up here, she said. They used to only hit the summer cottages once they were empty, but now they don't care if anybody's home or not. So that's why you started a circus, I said, trying to bring Joyce back around to the question. To break up a burglary ring? She laughed, and even with the extra weight she was carrying, Joyce looked good this morning. Her skin was smooth. She had parted her hair in the middle and braided it into 2 thick cornrows. And she was wearing a pair of silver hoop earrings I'd given her 3 Christmases ago. I won. Dared again how close Joyce was to Eddie she had sent him to pick me up at an airport over an hour from where he was. Which is the kind of favor you ask of a man who has more than a passing interest in you. I tried to remember the sound of Eddie's voice when he said Joyce's name. A man who is just a friend says a Ian's name differently than the man who is her lover. I've seen men give away a perfectly successful clandestine affair by casually dropping their girlfriends' names into an innocuous story without realizing that their tone of voice is suddenly filled with so many memories of sex and secrecy that it immediately sets off alarm bells in the mind of any wife who is serious about monogamy. I used to tell my lovers not to say my name at all, no matter how tempted they were. I knew. Their lips and tongues and teeth had memories of me that needed to remain between the two of us. I didn't remember hearing any of that in Eddie's voice. When he talked about Joyce, he sounded like he was about a favorite cousin talking. It's not a real circus, Joyce was saying. The oldsters just started calling it that because we took over and at the church that used to be called the Sewing Circle. It was the only women's group that met regularly other than the DEA. activity slot, conus's, and I knew I wasn't ready for that. 38. Joyce walked over to turn on the flame under the tea. What looks like crazy on an ordinary day, her kettle, and I watched her behind jiggling under the bright fabric of her gauzy skirt. It may have actually been a sewing circle a long time ago, Joyce said, but when I started going, it wasn't much of anything. Or sometimes they'd get together and take up money to put flowers on the altar, but that was about it. Joyce started going to church again after Mitch died. It's the same church we grew up in, but I knew she hadn't been for years. I never asked her about it, but I think she wanted to pray and she was too self-conscious to do it at home alone. Talking to God can make you feel like you're going off the deep end if you're not used to it. It's not as weird if there are some other people around doing it too. But if Joyce was so deep into it, she was going to Wednesday night prayer meetings, it's no wonder she was gaining weight. Stop looking at me like I'm crazy, Joyce said. There is method to my madness. Always, I said. That's one of your finer qualities, Joyce said when she started going to church regularly. She realized that a lot of the teenage girls she knew slightly from watching them grow up were there every Sunday too. They weren't really religious. It was just a place to hang around together after the service and show off their babies and gossip a little about the boys who never came unless they were forced. Joyce thought they might like a chance to do some
more of the same, plus whatever other interesting experiences
she could sneak in without scaring them away. They had enough social worker types in their lives already. Joyce leaned across the table and touched my arm lightly, like she wanted to be sure I was paying attention. These girls haven't got a chance, she said. There aren't any jobs and there aren't going to be any. They're stuck up here in the middle of the damn woods, watching talk shows, smoke hang crack, collecting welfare, and having babies. What kind of life is that? City life, I wanted to tell her, but Joyce had already, 39, hurled edge, gone into action. She invited the girls to come to a special meeting of the Wednesday sewing circle to talk about starting a nursery on Sunday morning, where they could leave the babies with somebody they trusted and enjoy the services, peace. That idea brought out 9 young women under the age of 20 who had between them a dozen children under the age of 5. The discussion was brief and to the point, resulting in a 9-week schedule laying out who was going to staff the nursery room, what her responsibilities would be, what supplies she might need, and how many kids she could handle. Questions were raised and discussed regarding discipline no
hitting. If the kid is to send upstairs, the mother feeding bottles with milk and juice and dried Cheerios only, and money for diapers. Joyce said she thought the pastor's special fund would kick in a few bucks if they asked the, and she volunteered to stay with the person who was staffing the each week so there would be another set of hands and eyes on all those babies. And because she said to May, like the cat who swallowed the, it gave her to talk to the girls one-on-one in a setting where they were doing something responsible by choice and where they were surrounded by children. Joyce is good at this kind of stuff. She went into social work in the first place because she really believes that people want to take care of themselves and their children, and if they allowed to do it with some dignity, everything else will fall into place. When I used to ask her why she and Mitch did ever leave Idlewild, she said it was a place for her because it was small enough so that if she did think she could really make a big difference in people's lives. Little. I could work myself to death in Detroit and Chicago, she said, and the problems are so big, nobody would even know the difference of 40-40. Joyce planned work like she knew it would, and what looks like crazy on an ordinary young mother started using the nursery. So they had to keep meeting on Wednesday to fold these new people into the schedule and to make sure everybody knew what was happening and what their particular job required. The old ladies found all of this less than fascinating, so pretty soon they just stopped coming. What was left was a loosely organized group of 17 young women, meeting once a week and handling a successful Sunday morning nursery school. Joyce wrote a small grant application and they got some outside funding to offset their costs and buy some toys and supplies. After a while, running the nursery program settled into a pleasant routine and they could finish all their business in half an hour. But they did want to be finished quickly, so they started talking about other things, like men and sex and how they were supposed to raise their kids without any jobs. The meetings got longer and longer and louder. Joyce did a lot of listening and the girls did a lot of talking. A lot of loud talking, which is what people tend to do when they finally find somebody who will listen. One time they were making so much noise, the choir director stopped his rehearsal and sent one of the lesser sopranos down to remind them that there were other activities going on in the building. A couple of weeks after that, somebody brought in a magazine article and they started talking about man is sharing, and things got pretty heated between two women who had been best friends but who had been unhappily sharing the same trifling brother for 2 years. Each one was waiting for the other one to get tired of the hassle and out gracefully. But neither of them would break, and now he was asking them to have three-way sex. They were tired of having their business whispered about in the street. But they knew everybody knew, and the man-sharing discussion set them free. They confronted each other in the middle of the sewing circus, but after a few minutes of shouting, they realized they liked each other a lot more than either one of them liked him. They burst into tears and forgave each other. A pearl everything. The resulting reconciliation got so rowdy that one of the altos told the first tenor that Joyce was running a circus over in the fellowship hall, and the name just stuck. The only problem, Joyce said, is that we got a new pastor about 6 months ago. Reverend Smith was so old, he did care what we did as long as we did burn the place down. But he finally retired, and now we got Reverend Anderson and his wife, Miss Jerry. And I think she going to be a royal pain. They came from a big church in Chicago where he had put together this giant youth program. But now they hear, and even though he has said anything to May, she keeps telling May how much they really want to channel the church resources into the more traditional areas of Christian education and missionary outreach. When I ask her about the youth program they had in the city and whether or not it could work here, she starts talking in tongues. That one of the reasons I want to go independent and open my own center. Joyce leaned toward May again. I know the circus is helping these girls, and I'm not about to let Jerry Anderson mess it up by making them read Bible stories about obedience and chastity when they want to talk about domestic violence and birth control. I looked at Joyce with her eyes shining and her voice full of the urgency and passion of the cause, and I remembered how much I liked growing up with her and Mitch. In most houses, when the kids wake up late at night and the grown folks are still up talking in low tones, the discussion is about money or trouble. In our house, it was about the design and distribution of a handbill, the best place to hold a meeting or stage a rally. I stand in the kitchen doorway and watch them until one or the other saw me and sent me back to bed. I remember feeling lucky because I lived in a house where people did just fuss about what was wrong with the world. They tried to fix it. Bad news last night while he was dropping me off here earlier we ate. Somebody broke out 2 windows in the of his house. He was here but a few minutes. Either some just happened to see us leaving or they had been watching the house. They did take anything, but he spent the morning cleaning up and replacing place. And he might have felt my reaction because he turned to me with a smile that successfully distracted me from anything but the of. How you doing? Wafusu XM 2 of pre-par of her car, and no word from the mining mama in the hospital had called. Was giving them another hour, and then she was just going drive back over there and be a pest until they told her what. We made a strange little threesome standing there looking at each other trying to figure out what else could go wrong with this day. Then the tant and Joyce went to it. Leaned back against the truck and smiled at me for the second time that morning. I have a message for you, I said suddenly. Pearl, who he looked at me still smiling. A message from the kid at the liquor store yesterday. Frank, the bad man, where you see him? Joyce took me by his house looking for Arthur. He said to tell you to stay black. I did say the stuff about Kung Fu since I had been thinking that too, and it made me feel guilty when Frank said it out loud. Eddie just shook his head. Young blood always looking for some contact, he said. Bumping through the world looking for the contact. Joyce came back out to say the hospital had finished with the baby tests and she seemed all right except for the cocaine, which she would have to deal with through withdrawal just like any other junkie. A hell of a way to spend your first couple of days in the real world. They had told Joyce a lot of crack babies scream when anybody touches them, but there was